History turns on seconds, and on April 14th, 1943, one decoded message threatened to tilt the Pacific War off its axis. By that point in the conflict, the Pacific was a ledger of staggering numbers. From Pearl Harbor to the Solomons, more than 1,200 warplanes lost. Over 30 major naval battles fought, and a front stretching 7,000 miles, dragging nations, fleets, and entire generations into a storm none could fully control. But what if a single transmission, just 203 Japanese characters, could bend this vast war toward a new direction? What if the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man whose planning reshaped oceans, appeared on an itinerary that should never have existed? And what happens when the enemy learns exactly where he'll be, down to the minute? These questions haunted the black and white briefing rooms of Pearl Harbor the moment Station Hypo cracked the code. The analysts, drained by months of hauling blades through enemy ciphers, stared at the decoded lines with a stillness that felt unnatural. There it was. Departure 0600 Rabaul. Arrival 0945 Balal, Bougainville. Aircraft 2 Guatram transports, 6 escorts. It wasn't just a schedule, it was a window, a narrow, trembling seam in the war's fabric, one that might never appear again. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, would be in the air. The very leader who had warned Japan that war with the United States would awaken a sleeping giant. The strategist whose mind had shaped Midway, the Solomons, and the opening blows that scarred American memory. And now he would fly over a stretch of jungle and ocean, thinly watched, lightly shielded, and impossibly far from any American base. On paper, the math didn't work. Bougainville lay 435 miles from the nearest Allied airfield. No American fighter had ever intercepted anything at that distance. Fuel limits, navigation hazards, open ocean. 1,000 reasons to dismiss the idea. And yet one reason not to. If the schedule was real, Yamamoto would be suspended in the sky for 10 vulnerable minutes. A meeting convened in Admiral Chester Nimitz's headquarters. Officers entered quietly. They left with the weight of an entire theater on their shoulders. The question on the table was as sharp as a drawn blade. Should the United States strike a single man to shift an entire war? Not out of vengeance, not out of anger, but out of cold, strategic calculus. Could removing one commander fracture the enemy's confidence? Could it shorten a war that had already devoured islands, fleets, and futures? Orders traveled fast. Across the ocean, on Guadalcanal's steel mat runway, a fighter squadron waited unaware that they were about to be handed a mission that history would later call impossible. And as the sun broke over Henderson Field, a story of precision, daring, and near superhuman navigation was quietly set in motion. Because sometimes war does not hinge on armies. Sometimes it hinges on a handful of pilots, a compass, and a clock. Before dawn on Guadalcanal, the air still carried the scorched scent of battles fought only months earlier. The island had already consumed over 7,000 American lives and more than 19,000 Japanese dead or missing, turning every reef and ridgeline into a silent marker of a war spiraling far beyond human scale. By early 1943, the Pacific was no longer a chain of islands. It was a graveyard of burned-out aircraft, shattered hulls, and ambitions dragged into the deep. Against that backdrop of staggering loss, Major John Mitchell stepped into the briefing room holding a clipboard that felt heavier than steel. The decoded itinerary from Station Hypo lay printed in clean, neat lines, but its implications thundered. If Yamamoto's schedule was accurate, it offered the United States a chance so rare that even generals hesitated to speak it aloud. And if it was inaccurate? Then 18 American pilots would vanish into the Pacific with little more than a footnote to mark their sacrifice. Mitchell, tall and taciturn, inhaled once and began outlining the cold parameters of a mission shaped by arithmetic, not hope. Distance to target, 435 miles. Total round trip, 870 miles. Margin for error, 0. The numbers were merciless. Most U.S. fighters in theater, the F-4F Wildcat, the P-40 Warhawk, could barely stretch past 300 combat miles before hunger for fuel dragged them down. Even the powerful F-4U Corsair reached the edge of its limits at 400 miles, provided its pilot neither climbed nor turned aggressively, a condition impossible in an intercept. Only one aircraft could make the run, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, a machine fed by belief and engineering audacity. Twin engines, twin booms, a nose packed with firepower, and, most crucially, a fuel system that allowed over 1,150 miles of theoretical flight with drop tanks attached. Still, theoretical meant nothing over a restless ocean. Mitchell began hauling blades through the math. At 2,000 revolutions per minute and 32 inches of manifold pressure, each Allison V1710 engine would drink 70 gallons per hour, or 140 gallons total. That meant roughly 280 gallons on the outbound leg, 100 for the climb and combat, and 280 for the return. With 410 gallons internal and two 165-gallon drop tanks, the pilots had margin for only a handful of small errors. A stray climb, a late turn, a gust of wind drifting them off course. Any miscalculation could erase the formation long before they ever saw Bougainville. He drew the course on the map, a sharp, disciplined dogleg angled toward the Russell Islands, then northwest into empty blue. No landmarks, no radio calls, nothing but a compass card and a stopwatch, scraping out seconds that could not be wasted. If Mitchell was wrong by even 1 degree over the 2-hour flight, the formation would miss Yamamoto by 5 miles, far enough that the bombers could slip by unnoticed. 5 miles. 5 miles that could change the war. The room tightened as the pilots absorbed the stakes. These were men who had already clawed through some of the Pacific's fiercest air battles. They had watched friends spiral into the sea, engines coughing out smoke. They had landed on damaged runways under fire, yet nothing had demanded this kind of precision, not before, not ever. Captain Thomas Lanfier remembered the moment years later. There was no whispering, no comments, just the sound of pencils stopping. Because once Mitchell explained the route, each man understood. If they were even slightly off schedule, the entire mission disintegrated. Mitchell pressed deeper into the logic. They would fly at 10 to 50 feet above the waves, skimming the Pacific so low that salt spray might streak the canopy. At that altitude, they would hide beneath Japanese radar arcs. But flying that low also meant the pilots would have no horizon line, nothing to anchor their internal sense of balance. One wrong banking angle in the glare of sunrise could pull a plane into the sea. This was not just flying. This was threading a needle through a storm. Then came the quiet moment, brief, fragile, when Mitchell looked up from his notes. "Gentlemen," he said, "timing is everything." And for the first time, the pilots understood why the mission felt so unreal. They weren't intercepting just any aircraft. They were intercepting time itself. Outside, the P-38 seconds waited in a row, their twin tails catching the first grey hints of dawn. Mechanics dragged dust across the steel-mat runway, preparing the fighters for a mission history would later struggle to believe. Pilots tightened gloves, checked watches, and looked toward the horizon, where the Pacific inhaled the rising Sunday. This was the moment where planning ended and destiny began to move. And as the engines prepared to roar to life, the story slid seamlessly toward its next chapter, a journey across 435 miles of open ocean, where nothing existed except water, wind, and the thin thread of a plan that could not break. At 7:13 a.m., the 18 P-38 Lightnings tore off Henderson Field, dragging dust and heat through steel-gray air. Their twin Allison engines hauled blades of sound that rattled the palm groves and echoed through the hills, still scarred from 6 months of fighting. Guadalcanal had already consumed over 7,100 Americans, 19,000 Japanese, and nearly 40 ships from both sides. Every departure from this runway carried the shadow of those numbers, cold, immovable, and carved into the island like a warning. But the men climbing into the morning light were guided by something sharper than fear. They were fed by belief, belief in Mitchell's math, belief in the lightning's impossible range, belief that a war this vast could bend around the precision of a single mission. Within minutes, the formation dropped low, far lower than doctrine ever intended. 50 feet, 30 feet, sometimes 20. Close enough for salt spray to smear across canopies. Close enough that the Pacific looked less like an ocean and more like a blade, waiting. For the next 2 hours, the sky was not a place, it was a test. No radio calls, no landmarks. Only a compass card trembling slightly from engine vibration, and Mitchell's stopwatch cutting seconds into something almost sacred. By early 1943, the Pacific had already swallowed thousands of aviators lost to fuel starvation, tropical storms, instrument failures, and the unforgiving geometry of long-range flight. Over 3,000 American aircraft had vanished into water deeper than the Grand Canyon. Flying 435 miles over open ocean wasn't just dangerous. It was statistical defiance. But the formation held. Mitchell scanned the panel airspeed steady at 185 indicated, fuel burn tracking, almost painfully close to his predictions. At that throttle setting, each Lightning inhaled 140 gallons an hour, a number that hung over the mission like a silent metronome. His men knew their fate wasn't tied to enemy fighters. Their fate was tied to mathematics. Behind him, Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber flew as if connected by invisible wire. Both men understood the stakes. If Mitchell was wrong by even 1 degree, the squadron would miss Yamamoto's flight path entirely. If they turned too early, they would never find the transports. If they turned too late, fuel margins would collapse, and the Pacific would have the final word. Halfway through the run, the ocean shifted from smooth silver to restless blue. Small whitecaps slapped the hull bottoms of the P-38 seconds. Pilots adjusted grip, corrected drift, and continued slicing through the air at treetop altitude with the discipline of machines built for a single purpose. The sun climbed higher, throwing long black and white shadows across the wings. Shadows almost symbolic. The war itself was a world of hard contrasts. Light and dark, hope and fear, precision and chaos, victory and loss. The pilots knew that behind every mile they flew were families waiting, battles raging, and a world praying for an end to a conflict that had already taken more than 30 million lives across continents and seas. Yet here they were, 18 men carving a straight line through emptiness, chasing a point in time that could shift the momentum of an entire hemisphere. At 8:33 a.m., after 2 hours of silence so pure it felt like a physical pressure inside the cockpit, Mitchell lifted his chin. Land. A thin, dark shape rose through the haze, the southern edge of Bougainville, exactly where it should be. Not 5 miles off course. Not 3. Less than 2. For a moment, the cockpit filled with a quiet no one could hear, the kind of quiet men feel only when standing at the edge of destiny. Mitchell's math had held, his timing had held, and now the final act was about to begin. He eased the formation upward, slow, deliberate climbing from the wave tops toward attack altitude. The lightnings shed their low-level skin and became hunters rising into a sky where the enemy never expected them. Behind them, fuel gauges slid closer toward danger. Ahead, the coastline sharpened, the jungle darkened, and the clock marched toward 9:34, the predicted intercept. This chapter ends at the moment breath and steel tightened together. The moment the P-38 seconds climbed above the treetops of southern Bougainville, the mission shifted from mathematics to instinct. The air thinned, the jungle opened beneath them like a dark scar. And far ahead, right where Station Hypo said it would be, a faint formation glimmered against the morning haze. 2 Mitsubishi G4M transports, 6 A6M0 escorts. Altitude, roughly 8,000 feet. Time, 9:34 a.m. Error margin, less than 1 minute. Mitchell's breath tightened. After a 435-mile ocean crossing, after 2 hours of silence, After fuel calculations that allowed no indulgence, there it was. The itinerary, the Japanese believed, private, was hanging in the sky like a secret written in sunlight. For a second, the cockpit felt soundless, almost holy. Then Mitchell snapped back into motion. He swung his arm an order without radio. Attack Plan Z, split now. 12 P-38 seconds clawed upward into cover formation, engines hauling blades through heated air, climbing to meet the Zero escorts. The remaining 4 Lightnings, Lanphier, Barber, Holmes and Hine, peeled away in a hard banking dive. The killer flight, fed by belief and momentum. Below them, Bougainville's canopy stretched to the horizon, a jungle that had already swallowed tens of thousands in ground campaigns, disease, heat, starvation, and the brutal mathematics of the South Pacific. This island chain had cost both sides over 200 ships sunk and more than 50,000 casualties by early 1943. And now it would host a moment that history would replay for decades. The Japanese formation approached unaware, their spacing loose, their escort altitude complacent, their confidence absolute. No one expected American fighters to appear 400 miles behind their own front lines. At 9:35, the first Zero pilot finally saw the glint of sun off a silver twin-boom shape far below. Too far, too late. His warning call cut through the escort, but Mitchell's pilots were already moving. Above, the cover flight slammed into the 6 Zeros, not with chaos, but with choreography learned the hard way, through missions where entire squadrons had been lost. By 1943, the Pacific Air War had turned into a grinder. More than 12,000 Japanese aircraft and 8,000 American planes had already been destroyed across the theater. Every pilot understood what air combat meant by this stage of the war, precision or disappearance. The sky cracked into motion, lightnings diving, Zeros climbing, engineers screaming. No graphic violence, only the clash of destiny and machinery. Down below, the killer flight closed the distance on the 2 G4 Miss Bettys, as Allied intelligence called them. Long wings, slender fuselage, range for days, but thin skin and vulnerable fuel systems, designed for reach, not resilience. Lanphier rolled to intercept the lead transport. Barber dove toward the trailing one. Holmes and Hine provided cover from behind. Mitchell's plan depended on seconds measured not by clocks but by nerves. The Bettys began evasive S-turns, engines laboring. Their escorts were locked far above, unable to break free. For the first time on this mission, the Japanese pilots understood what they faced, a strike born not of luck, but of intelligence and engineering far outside their expectations. Lanphier hauled his P-38 into a left-slicing turn, lining up for a deflection pass. His tracer lines stitched the air, not graphic, not brutal, simply the mechanical language of 2 aircraft meeting at speed. The lead bomber wavered, banking sharply, unable to maintain its course. Below, Barber closed on the second transport with grinding determination. His hands moved instinctively, guiding the Lightning into the narrow arc needed for an intercept. His approach angle was textbook, the kind instructors dream of, the kind war almost never gives. For 90 seconds, the air was carved by intention, American and Japanese pilots locked in a dance that spanned training schools, design factories, code-breaking rooms, and the long chain of events that had brought them here. When the passes ended, one fact hung unshakable over Bougainville. The lead transport could no longer continue its journey. It dropped toward the jungle canopy, disappearing into the shadows below without spectacle, without dramatics, only the silent weight of history turning its page. Above, the Zero escorts broke off, abandoning pursuit to protect the remaining transport carrying Vice Admiral Ugaki. The sky, moments earlier boiling with motion, settled into a strange, exhausted quiet. Fuel gauges in the P-38 seconds dipped toward danger. The mission's final objective was complete, but survival was no guarantee. The Lightnings regrouped. Mitchell checked his map, his stopwatch, and the shrinking numbers on his fuel flow. Every man understood the truth. The return flight would be a second battle, one fought against distance, exhaustion, and the Pacific itself. The jungle swallowed the last trace of the fallen transport, and for a moment, the world above Bougainville turned silent, too silent, for a war that had consumed more than 30 million lives across continents. But silence was only the midpoint. The mission wasn't finished. History never ends at the moment of impact. It ends when those who made it home choose to keep moving. Mitchell looked down at his fuel gauges, needles sliding dangerously toward empty. The P-38 Lightnings turned south, hauling blades through columns of heated air. Engines humming with the strained rhythm of machines pushed to their limits. Beneath them, the Pacific stretched into a metallic sheet of grey-blue, a color worn thin by the weight of thousands of aircraft already lost to storms, fuel starvation, and long-range missions that stretched farther than human endurance. 17 Lightnings climbed. One already lagged. One would not return. But they didn't know that yet. They only knew that the sky still had one more test. Far below, Bougainville's vast green canopy concealed the brutal arithmetic of war. Over 60,000 casualties between both sides in the Solomons campaign, thousands more claimed not by gunfire, but by malaria, starvation, and jungle rot. The island was a natural fortress, a battlefield that chewed through men regardless of uniform. And now, in that black and white landscape, a new set of numbers seized control. Fuel flow, airspeed, distance remaining. Mitchell recalculated the return leg for the 10th time. The mission had pushed every variable range. Navigation, timing to the edge of collapse. Precision had carried them this far. Now, endurance had to carry them the rest of the way. The P-38 seconds leveled off at cruising altitude, their silhouettes sharp against the morning glare. Sunlight flashed across their wings, turning metal into monochrome white reflection, black shadows, no middle tone. It was the Pacific's own film reel, the war stripped to essentials. Machines and men, light and dark, hope dragging against exhaustion. Behind Mitchell, Lieutenant Raymond Hine began to drift. His fuel burn had spiked during the climb. The others saw it but didn't look too long. In war, some truths could only be acknowledged by continuing forward. Still, Mitchell made a tiny adjustment, lower throttle, smoother climb rate, a silent offering to fate. Every pilot kept glancing at Henderson Field's direction as if they could will the island closer. At 100 miles out, the sun intensified, flattening the horizon until sky and water fused into a single blinding strip. Eyes strained through salt smears, muscles cramped from holding low-altitude formation for so long. One pilot later recalled that his shoulders felt as if they'd been wired to the engine mounts. The air was thinning, fuel was thinning, time was thinning, and yet the mission held together, fed by belief, not by comfort. As they crossed the final stretch, one P-38 wavered, dipped slightly, then steadied. Hine's aircraft. Mitchell didn't break formation to look. Leaders often know the truth before they accept it, and the truth was simple. Some men carry history to the threshold, others carry it across. Then, like a promise emerging from fog, the faint outline of Guadalcanal rose ahead, jagged, uneven, unmistakable. The sight hit every pilot like a pulse of electricity. Henderson Field. Home. The first Lightning approached the runway in a shallow descent. The tires struck steel matting, dragging dust, engines coughing, a final groan as if relieved to surrender their burden. One by one, the fighters rolled in, each landing heavier with the weight of what they had accomplished and lighter with the fuel left in their tanks. Most landed with less than 10 minutes of fuel remaining. One landed with a gauge showing nearly zero. Another never arrived. Raymond Hine's Lightning vanished somewhere in the great blue miles behind them. No smoke column, no signal, no final call. Only absence. In the Pacific War, absence was a language all its own. The squadron did not cheer when the engines shut down. They exhaled. Some sat on the wings, heads bowed, hands trembling. Others stared blankly across the runway, replaying the exact moments that had decided the mission's fate. And Mitchell, who had carried 18 men across an ocean with nothing but math, instinct and belief, walked the length of the landing strip alone before speaking a word. News spread rapidly through Guadalcanal, then through fleet commands, then across the Pacific. When Washington confirmed the mission's success, it wasn't triumph that dominated military cables, it was disbelief. A 435-mile interception, to the minute, in a war where even supply ships rarely arrived on schedule. When Tokyo finally announced Yamamoto's death a month later, shock rippled through the Imperial Navy. It wasn't simply the loss of a commander, it was the loss of certainty, the realization that their codes were broken, their airspace permeable, and their long-range defenses vulnerable. American strategists saw something else, proof that precision, human and mechanical, could rewrite a war whose scale once seemed too massive to influence at the level of a single mission. But beneath all strategy lies something quieter, deeper. It wasn't vengeance that had carried 18 lightnings across the Pacific. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't even ambition. It was conviction. The conviction that courage, when paired with clarity and purpose, can travel farther than engines, farther than range charts, farther than enemy lines. The conviction that even in a world torn into black and white, human spirit can carve a streak of light straight through the darkness. Operation Vengeance became more than a mission. It became proof. Proof that precision can overcome distance. Proof that belief can overcome fear. Proof that history, in its vastness, can still be shaped by the steady hands of ordinary men given an extraordinary task. And long after the Pacific quieted, long after fleets rusted and runways overgrew, the echo of that morning, April 18th, 1943, still carried one message. Sometimes the sky does not choose the victors. Sometimes the victors choose the sky.